Welcome to the Great Conversation. Today we're going to explore St. Benedict and his rule, which has been so decisive in the shaping of Western civilization. St. Benedict belongs to a period of turmoil in the West, right after the fall of the empire in the West, which happened in, one could calculate, in 476 with the deposition by the German warlord Odoacer of Romulus Augustulus, this child who was supposedly the emperor. And a few years later, Benedict was born. He was born in Umbria, in Nursia, to a family that of some means, and he studied in Rome in this period of change, a profound change. And as a general framing thought, we're confronted when we think about the end of the empire in the West about how to secure order when everything that you've known has dissolved. The Gothic kings will try to establish new orders. Kingdoms will come from the empire and eventually take shape as the Western Europe we know. But Benedict himself had to forge a personal order in a time of chaos. And we would want to look at his great rule as a way of finding out guidance for our own lives in terms of an order in a time where we might feel that the solid things are giving way. Monasticism, which is so characteristic of the late antique period, as historians have come to call it, the time between, as the Roman Empire in the West is collapsing and leading into the early Middle Ages. Monasticism is a product of ages that are giving way. We have the birth of monasticism and we always tend to draw back to St. Anthony of the Desert, who was living during the crisis of the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, and born around 250. And from there, this idea exploded across the East. Eastern Christianity took it on very enthusiastically and would make its way eventually to the West. And as things were dissolving, as the order in the West was dissolving, it was monasteries that would preserve a sense of civilization, because they were cities of a different kind. They were supposedly like the New Jerusalem. They were different from regular cities because they were supposed to be like households. The head was an abbot, from the Aramaic word for father, Abba. So, and they're brothers in the male monasteries. These are brothers under a father. So it's a city that is also a family. Oikos and polis are united here. So that's the intimacy that you would expect from the kingdom of God, which is what these men and women who gave themselves to the monastic life were trying to bring about, try to instantiate the kingdom of God, when the kingdoms of the earth especially are in distress. And in fact, even though their goal was otherworldly, they had an immense effect on the course of history. A brief overview of the time that Benedict lived through. After Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor in the West, what we come to call the Byzantine Empire sent Theodoric the Great, as we know him, to deal with Odoacer, and he took over royal power in Italy in 493. It was in Theodoric's court that Boethius, the great philosopher, served, and it was Theodoric who ordered the imprisonment and execution of Boethius. Boethius's work, The Consolation of Philosophy, had an immense influence on the Middle Ages, and that was written while he was imprisoned. Under Theodoric, who was an Arian Christian, his execution of the Trinitarian Boethius exposed this grave fault line in the new Germanic kingdoms. Most of the Goths had been evangelized by Arians, so that's the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths were Arians. The one grouping, Germanic grouping that wasn't Arian, were the Franks, and that's going to be important because it will be the Frankish kingdoms that the papacy will look to in a few centuries away from Byzantium. So Clovis was was the first Trinitarian Christian king of the Franks. He defeats the Visigoths in 407 at the Battle of Vouillé, and Justinian takes over as Byzantine emperor, the emperor of the East in 527, and he begins his attempt to reconquer the Italian peninsula. And he begins in 535, the last of the Gothic Wars. This goes on for about 20 years, and that's the time. Those are the last years of Benedict's life. This was a time of great distress in Italy. The wars were devastating for the Italian peninsula. Justinian won in the end nominally, but had left the Roman heartland in tatters. And so much so that when the Lombards invaded in 568, another Germanic tribe, there was nothing to be done about it. The Lombards had pretty much free reign. And it's in that context that Gregory the Great arose. He was born around 540, and he's the one, Pope Gregory the Great, who provides us the earliest substantive account of Benedict's life, and in the second book of his dialogues. Gregory the Great is very important because he's seen as perhaps the initiator of the medieval papacy, in the sense that here's a man who was from a wealthy family. He was urban prefect of Rome. He gave that up. He used his money to found several monasteries. It seems to be the case that those monasteries used the rule of St. Benedict. So in some sense, Gregory the Great was a Benedictine himself. And because the Byzantines had no more ability to really control events in Italy, it fell to the popes to try to maintain order. So the management of temporal affairs, Gregory took on. He had the background as being urban prefect. So he managed these vast estates that the church had. He tried to monasticize the clergy. That is, he lived a life, even though he was kind of drafted into being pope, he continued to live as much of a monastic life as he could, and he tried to draw his fellow clergy into that. And he set out missions, and this is very important because the prestige of the papacy depended, fundamentally on its ability to convert the peoples of Europe. And so we have the Irish, the Hiberno-Scottish mission, and the Anglo-Saxon missions, which were very much inflected by Gregory's initial attempts there to convert Anglo-Saxon England. Irish and Anglo-Saxon missionaries that came back to the continent and founded monasteries that were very rigorous. They were the ones to do it because they were more learned than the monks of the continental kingdoms, because they had to learn Latin very seriously. Because the Celtic language of the Irish and the Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxon monks meant that they, unlike those in Gaul or in Spain, their language wasn't close to the Latin, so they had to really study. So that studiousness of the monastics would be part of that legacy of the Irish and Anglo-Saxon missionaries. So that's some background here of the great dramatic context of the birth of monasticism, or the birth of Benedictine monasticism in the West. So, as mentioned, the monastic movement really gets going. We put St. Anthony as the head there in the desert of Egypt. And he lived an eremitic lifestyle, at least at first. That is, the hermit is the one who's a desert dweller. That's from the Greek. St. Pachomius would then shift this hermit-like lifestyle towards a more common lifestyle, the cenobitic, koinos bios, to live together. And then in the East, we have the shorter and the lesser and the greater rules of St. Basil the Great, these are the foundational monastic documents for the East. St. Augustine seems to have written the first Latin rule. So we already know that the monastic ideal was very, very strong for those who wanted to be earnest Christians in the West. And then St. John Cassian would bring a lot of the wisdom of the East into the West. We have as the first major monastic in the West, St. Martin of Tours. Out of all of this wealth of monastic experience, St. Benedict draws and forms his own rule. When he went to Rome to study humanities, liberal arts, he found that according to Gregory the Great's life, he found his fellow students caught up in vice, and that was a grave threat to his sense of what life should be. So he departs 40 miles east into the mountains and eventually to a cave at Subiaco, and that's where he begins his eremitical life. He eventually is drafted to become the head of a monastery, but he's found to be too rigorous and they try to poison him. He eventually leaves to found the mother house, as it were, of the Benedictine Confederation at Monte, Cassino, which is between Rome and Naples, and that was more or less in 529. That's there, that institute that he wrote, and it's for that institute that he wrote the rule. All right, so what we have here is this, the birth of Benedictine monasticism is going to provide the nuclei around which Western civilization is able to coalesce in times when the continuity with the classical past has been greatly shaken by the fall of the empire in the West. When the empire was Christianized starting with Constantine, you have this difficult phenomenon where a religion that had been countercultural, as it were, had been persecuted, had been underground, hidden, it now is elevated to provide the liturgies of the state, of the empire. And so we're going to find it, there's a lot of resonance there between the combination of church and state, as it were, in ancient civilizations, and including the pagan imperial civilization and the new established church of the empire. So we have what looks like the recrudescence of political mythology. That is, the Christian church now has the power. It's associated with the power. And so one of the questions will be, how do we maintain the earnestness of Christian existence when it has the upper hand? When the motives for being Christian are conflated with the motives of worldly advancement. So an empire that has now established the church will, instead of saying you can't have preferment in the government because you are a Christian, now in fact you're preferred if you are a Christian. And so the question of, as Kierkegaard will later raise, of Christian authenticity becomes very poignant and urgent. And Christians who feel this question deeply, personally, they're going to be drawn to monasticism as an alternative lifestyle. Characteristic, obviously, celibacy, which is not really in the first place a matter of a war against sensuality. It is a way of withdrawing from the world, because what marriage does is put you into the world, put you into the need for making money and so making plans and all of that. So celibacy is a way of withdrawing from the world, which is what monasticism is, it seems. Anachoresis, it's a way of stepping back from the social tensions, the injustices, and the barbarisms of common social existence. But then with Cenobitic monasticism, you've got a new common life. And Benedict, who makes the common way of doing monasticism as opposed to the hermit-like way, the norm in the West, he moderates the kind of superhero ascetic exploits of people like Simon the Stylite, who lives on the top of a pillar for decades. He embraces asceticism, but embraces it in a reasonable way. Asceticism being that spiritual athleticism, exercises for making one a great instrument of God. And that would include fasting, of course, continence, and not having one's own will. And that's where we get to the question I want to pose here. Can obedience serve the cultivation of liberty? This is going to get at the very paradox of how the city in the wilderness, the monastery, can become so wealthy. The monasteries will have these cycles of becoming very successful in worldly terms, and yet it's also constantly the focus of renewed reforming tendencies, a way of trying to direct back into Christian existence a vigor, a desire for the apostolic life, the vita apostolica, which we see in Acts 2 and 4, where people are living together, sharing things, not owning private property, and so on. That's the vision of the kingdom of God that the monastery promises, even though over and over we see the cycles of decadence and reform in the monastic world. Obedience is important here because as far as the asceticism necessary, probably the most difficult for any person, even if moderation, food and drink and so on can be difficult, to have one's will bounded is very painful. The monastic would say this is necessary for true freedom. The modern person will say that doesn't make any sense. And then we need to see if we can get a meeting of the minds here. Would it make sense to say that when a child is growing up, to make sure that the child is learning habits that are for the child's flourishing, such as not gratifying him or herself instantly, or making sure that the child shares and avoids dangers? One has to teach the child to trust those who have care for him or her, and that involves obedience. Now, this analogy, of course, is that if we're talking about adult human beings, it can't obviously be said, well, the abbot of the monastery can simply treat his charges as children. A modern would say, isn't there some difference? And it seems to me that we'd have to ask that question. But then the response of the monastic would be, but let's not kid ourselves. If reality doesn't have a voice that confronts us and with some power, I can say, well, I'm paying attention to reality and I'm being free by doing what seems best to me. But of course, we all think that, and we see how much we hurt each other, how much we exploit each other, how much we assert ourselves and try to aggrandize ourselves. If we want, as the school of the Lord's service, which is the one way of framing the goal of the rule, constituenda est ergo nobis dominici schola servitii, it is necessary, therefore, to constitute a school of the Lord's service. If that schooling involving a training of the will is not a figment of a fevered religious imagination, perhaps there is something to be said if we want to learn how to serve others, as well as to contemplate reality, which is the great rhythm of the Benedictine monastic life, right? Is to be active, to labor, to use one's hands, to provide a place of hospitality for the poor and for travelers. The monasteries of Europe were a way of, it was social service, taking care of the indigent. It was a hotel network. This was a way of providing an actual network of care on the continent in an age where the political structures had dissolved. Well, how do we learn how to serve others and contemplate? I mean, is it just something we come out into the world having the ability to do? In fact, we could all recognize that it takes training. And that training, according to the Benedictine, is going to crucially involve obedience. Obedience to an actual person with authority who can curb our will. Again, the flip side of that is, well, isn't the abbot's power too great? There is this, what comes to be in the late antique period with Christianization is this kind of intimate surveillance of the soul, a governmentality, as Foucault would call it. And that's new in the world. And I think there are great dangers there, but I'm going to go back and forth here. But if we must recognize that the self is to be overcome, that if I, or if anybody is to not be a tyrant over my neighbor, I need to be curbed. But then the question, again, to flip, who's doing the curbing and who curbs that person? In the rule of St. Benedict, there are checks. And this is very important. I think it's absolutely essential to the Constitution of Europe. And that is that there's a written rule that binds the abbot. The abbot must take counsel. The abbot must listen to all the members of his community. And in doing so, he's helping to neutralize the social tensions that are outside the monastery walls. That is, rich and poor come to be monks, but the abbot is supposed to treat everyone equally as regards their human status. And so in that sense, the city in the wilderness is taking from the cities of the world and is neutralizing all those social antagonisms, if everything is going well, if the abbot himself is truly charitable, has gone through this process. The Benedictine life is centered around obedience, stability, and what Benedict calls conversatio morum, which is a hard word to translate. It has something to do with repeated conversion of morals, and to live together according to a rule, to live in conversation, conversatio. In fact, Benedict seems to equate religious life with a conversation, which of course we at the Great Conversation really love, and this is a very beautiful thing. And if we think about stability, that is, you're promising you're going to be at this monastery for the rest of your life. There's going to be lots of silence, which allows you to be still, which allows one to fulfill that ancient Greek ideal of knowing thyself, that is, in that Augustinian sense that if I'm going to find God, I've got to turn inward. But to be able to sit with oneself, and try it, if you sit for just 5 minutes, how much noise there is in one's head. So the monastic life is meant to help turn the dial down on that noise so that one can actually start to go inward, know oneself, and therefore hopefully come to God. And then it increases the ability to attend to reality. And I think here of the parallel with Thoreau, going out into the wilderness, living like a hermit on Walden Pond. And he's like any naturalist writer, he's paying attention to the most minute things of the book of nature, right? And the monk is supposed to cultivate that, precisely that kind of ethos. And finally, the Benedictine monk lives a life that is structured by liturgical prayer. Originally, they prayed all 150 Psalms, the Psalter, every week. And they do what is called the Divine Office of the Liturgy of the Hours. This is one of the 4 volumes in the modern version. And they would pray 8 canonical hours throughout the day. And this was so essentially the work that Benedict had in mind. He calls it the Opus Dei, the work of God. So this prayer, this where they come together as a community and they're chanting. So it's this beautiful common celebration of God, an acknowledgement of the pain of the world, which you find in the Psalms, but also all the joys and the deliverance that God promises, the fugitive light that shows up even when we're in the darkest places. The Psalms are the great poems that keep Europe going when so much has been lost. And from those raised voices, raised together, voices that are honed against each other, living the greatest ascetical discipline of having to live close to another human being and get along with that human being. That's really where our wills get shaped, so we can actually learn to be charitable, to love one another, and then to radiate into the world a new kind of ethos, the ethos of a supernatural charity, that is of a love that is more than human. that was always the ideal, and it seems to me that sometimes it actually had effect in this world. And in any case, the world we have would not have come about without the great religious genius of Saint Benedict, and without this grand vision of a common life spent together, attending to reality, singing to God, and laboring for the fruition of the world.